A King County teenager with severe disabilities spent nearly 10 years trapped in a house of squalor, all while under the state's care.
Which is why today a judge signed off on a $5.5 million settlement with the Department of Social and Health Services and a private nursing agency.
Como investigator Tracy Vetter looked into what happened to Heather Curtis, and she's here now with shocking information about warnings that were ignored. Tracy?
Well, you know, the conditions that Heather Curtis was finally rescued from are horrific. And I'll warn you now, they are heartbreakingly graphic. What we've uncovered is just as troubling. For years, teachers and caregivers trying to warn the state that Heather was in trouble, maybe even in danger.
Oh, yeah. Ready?
This is the face of pure joy. At last, 23-year-old Heather Curtis is finally experiencing a life surrounded by love and care.
You didn't really get today.
But the road here has been bitter and filled with pain.
Oh, yeah. It was nice.
Compare Heather's face today to the young woman rescuers discovered in this house 4 years ago. A King County Sheriff's detective describes the scene in court documents. Heather was flailing and moaning like a wounded animal. She was skeletal-like with dried, caked feces on her body and naked except for a soiled diaper. Responders described the odor in Heather's room as overwhelming. It was littered with used diapers and dried vomit.
To me, she suffered.
Doc Williams is now Heather's court-appointed guardian.
She came from a bad situation.
From the age of 9 to 19, Washington's DSHS paid April Henderson to care for Heather. Neither April nor her husband Jeffrey had outside employment. Court records confirm they and their 4 children lived off Heather's Social Security disability and the money from DSHS, a little over $4,000 a month.
A lot of her learning and everything has been stunted.
The Hendersons pled guilty to criminal mistreatment, serving 9 months of home detention. But how did the state allow Heather to live in such horrible conditions in the first place?
Say hi.
Heather has cerebral palsy and spastic quadriplegia. She doesn't speak, can't walk or crawl. She is completely vulnerable.
I think this is profoundly a sad case, and the system's clearly broken. When something like this can happen.
Catherine Kent is a former DSHS social worker, now a lawyer and a pro tem court commissioner specializing in family law.
Zeroed in on the main pieces of information.
She examined Heather's history with DSHS. Kent says DSHS violated its own policies by putting Heather in the Hendersons' care.
They didn't do any sort of background check, no licensure investigation, nothing at all.
For nearly a decade, DSHS was flooded with warnings from teachers and caregivers. November 2004, a report of medical neglect. Heather has bad sores. December 2004, Heather isn't bathed regularly. Most of the time she smells of urine and feces, has no coat, and is dressed inappropriately for the cold. January 2005, Heather smells of cat pee, is self-abusive, and gagging herself. January 2009, a teacher is concerned for Heather's well-being. The next month, Heather is chronically dirty, cries and smells bad every day. Her bottom was crusted with old feces. 3 weeks later, Heather again has dried feces on her bottom, smells like a dog, urine and cigarette smoke, and hasn't been bathed or cleaned in days.
They ignored all of the overwhelming information that they had before them, that the child was at risk, that the child's needs were not being met, and she was in danger. They just ignored it.
CPS did open a couple of investigations based on teachers' reports, but closed them both shortly thereafter, ruling that the reports were unfounded, leaving Heather with the Hendersons. Then in October of 2012, Children's Hospital reports serious concerns about Heather, prompting DSHS to go in with law enforcement. She is finally rescued.
Good job.
Today, Heather's in a supported living program where 24/7 caregivers help with every aspect of her daily life.
You're welcome, Heather.
She attends music therapy once a week.
Okay.
Also, once a week, her favorite activity, water therapy. But it is the bare minimum of what Heather needs to try and regain a semblance of what she's lost while under DSHS protection.
They botched this case to Heather's extreme detriment.
Heather's guardian hired attorneys David P. Moody and Ian Bauer to sue DSHS. While the state has settled, Moody says they've received no explanation for how this happened.
Even after settling this lawsuit for almost $5 million of taxpayer money, they take no responsibility whatsoever for leaving Heather in a state of neglect that almost caused her demise.
DSHS would not go on camera, releasing the statement which says in part that any alleged neglect of our clients is upsetting, and that in the 4 years since Heather's rescue, their processes have continuously been revised to address these situations. Not enough for the people now watching out for Heather.
There's no accountability, there's no meaningful change, and that's the missing piece of the puzzle.
Tomorrow night, the Como investigators will address another alarming side of Heather's case. A nursing agency specifically charged with assessing Heather's well-being never reported her condition to authorities. Tonight, that agency is still on the state's payroll. Tracy Vetter, Como investigators.
A King County teenager living in squalor inside her guardian's home lost a third of her body weight in just 3 months. It happened while a state-paid nurse was making monthly visits to ensure the teen's well-being. Como investigator Tracy Vetter has been looking into the Heather Curtis case and joins us with that part of the story. Tracy?
You know, Heather Curtis can't walk, she can't talk, she can't feed herself. When investigative documents show that her weight dropped alarmingly to just 68 pounds, the visiting nurse and her agency, both mandatory reporters under state law, never called in Adult Protective Services. Good morning. Tracy Vetter with Como investigators. Can I speak with Valerie Crosby? Valerie Crosby co-owns Professional Registry of Nursing in Lakewood, an in-home nursing services agency that contracts with the state to oversee patient care. One of Crosby's patients was Heather Curtis, a young woman with cerebral palsy and spastic quadriplegia, completely vulnerable.
Have to drink.
For nearly a decade, the state paid April and Jeff Henderson to care for Heather. Then in October of 2012, law enforcement found Heather living in this squalid room with red marks on her ankles consistent with restraints, with teeth so badly rotted she needed 19 root canals. So malnourished, a later state investigation found they were fortunate Heather was still with us today. When that rescue happened, Heather had been under Crosby's oversight for 7 months.
This is the best example of the worst nursing we've ever seen.
Heather's new state-appointed guardian hired David P. Moody and Ian Bauer to sue Crosby and her PRN agency. Today, Heather is healthy, weighs just over 100 pounds, and attends weekly music and swim therapy sessions.
It's a step towards independence. It's a step to her becoming who she's going to be, and that it's amazing to watch.
According to court and public records obtained by the Como investigators, DSHS hired PRN to provide intensive, hands-on personal care support in the home. When a children's hospital nurse called Adult Protective Services with serious concerns about Heather, Crosby told investigators the Henderson home was filthy, the smell inside so horrible it burns, and that the last time she visited Heather, she was dirty and covered in vomit. But Crosby herself never called in APS.
As a mandatory reporter, she had the duty to call in help for Heather. She didn't do any of it. She simply shut the door and left Heather in the squalid mess.
We contacted Crosby's home and business several times requesting an interview with no response. Jay Crosby?
I am.
At the Lakewood office, only her husband Jay, the president of PRN, was available. Can I ask you a few questions first? Will you talk to us a little bit about the situation with Heather Curtis?
If you could turn the camera off, sure.
Jay Crosby agreed to talk to us only with the camera off. He says neither his wife Valerie nor PRN did anything wrong, that the Hendersons required advance notice of their visits and would not let them see Heather's bedroom. He adds Valerie had discussed with the DSHS case manager calling APS about Heather, but let it go after the case manager said she would do it.
The nurse, who's a mandatory reporter and who was hired to specifically make sure that her needs were being met, did nothing as well.
Catherine Kent is a former DSHS social worker and a court-designated expert. If a mandatory reporter fails to report suspected neglect, they could be charged with a misdemeanor. Now, DSHS never told the Department of Health about Crosby's lack of action, and DOH is the one that regulates nursing licenses. Instead, DSHS still pays PRN and Crosby more than $300,000 a year to oversee about 100 patients.
The taxpayers are still paying this nursing agency to check on vulnerable adults. It's outrageous, and it needs to come to a stop.
DSHS also declined to speak to us on camera, but in an email told us it had issued a corrective action plan to PRN and required it to go through mandatory reporter training. The state adds that in hindsight, DSHS should probably have reported Crosby and her agency to the Department of Health for failure to report neglect in Heather's case.
And Tracy, you mentioned a civil case against PRN.
That's right. It was settled actually yesterday, approved just yesterday by the courts. The nursing agency agreed to pay $770,000 for Heather, along with the $4.7 million from the state that should cover Heather's future care.
Glad she's in a safe place now. Tracy,
Yes.
thank you.